going to cover then some of the challenges and opportunities of the humanitarian operating environment that we are in. So it might be odd to start with humanitarian financing as an issue, but two reasons we often say that operations come to a halt in reality. One is safety and security, and it was interesting to hear your comments this morning, and the other is money, especially from my perspective as an NGO worker. Without the financing, we're going to run into problems. And one of the issues we face are competing emergencies, L3 emergencies. Does anyone have any idea of how many current L3 emergencies there are?
5.
The latest is on the OCHA website, 4. But what this is saying is that if you look at how it was originally designed, they did not expect to have so many L3 emergencies. And also from an NGO perspective, L3 emergencies is a UN classification. For NGOs and non-UN actors, we have many more priorities as well that we're looking at. And all of these need to be supported by humanitarian funding, which is increasingly in short supply. And so we're all faced with this challenge of how do we access the funding, how do we make a compelling case for our particular emergencies. And I don't think it's ever been more busy than it is now, and I'm sure they say this every year, but that's the feeling at least. I'm not sure about what you would say. And it's also a question of where the funding is going to. It might interest you to know that less than 0.02% of funding goes to local NGOs. And also that for example, a donor like my government, 78% of its funding goes to multilaterals, i.e. UN agencies, who then might subcontract to INGOs or NGOs, and 12% to NGOs. So the proportion of funding to different organizations also is a factor. And one of the challenges is who, at what point, should get the most funding. So if you're talking about rapid response organizations, should we be giving funding based on who can respond the quickest or who has the largest capacity? Perhaps it's a UN agency, and also who has the longest history in a country. And these are some of the questions that we are faced with. The other side of the coin, of course, is the politicization of aid that we are seeing, and I've seen certainly in some of the emergencies I've been involved in. How many of you here think your organizations work according to the humanitarian principles? Are we still impartial? Are we still neutral? Are these principles that we work under, or sorry? We have to strive to be, yeah. And the challenge is, I think we're competing with others who work as suppliers of aid, let me put it in those terms, who may not work according to those principles. And the trouble is that we are not differentiated from other suppliers of aid by the people we're trying to help. So we might strive to work according to humanitarian principles, but we may be working alongside others who are not. So how do we trade off the needs of the beneficiaries and accountability to the most vulnerable versus having to work in areas where we're working alongside non-state actors delivering aid as well? So there isn't an answer to that question, but it's something that we have to consider. And with cash-based programming especially, of course, cash can be used by anyone. So aid diversion, accountability of where that funding is going is another problem to deal with as well. And then, of course, it's country ownership of aid. For example, in the Ebola response now, a lot of the health system strengthening is going to come from bilateral aid between governments like the UK, the US, European Union, to these countries to develop their health systems. And that's probably something that is needed and was lacking before the Ebola outbreak happened. But in other contexts, it can also be challenging in terms of where is that aid going to be used. And if we divert from humanitarian principles in some contexts, we risk losing the reputation we have as independent actors in other contexts. And that's a challenge as well. We're finding that a lot of high-tech private sector companies want to be involved and bring their professional skills to the humanitarian sector. And often it can seem like they're looking for, they have a solution and they're trying to find a problem. So they're doing it the wrong way around. So often they're bringing high-tech solutions that don't work in these contexts because that's their skill set. Whereas sometimes low technology is what is needed. And what I mean by that is just simple innovation. And they say the best kind of innovation is actually when you have a lack of resources and you find other ways to do it, i.e. local communities at the very lowest level of where you're trying to deliver. They're already innovating in ways that don't involve, computer chips and expensive technology. Beneficiary participation will also come on to local community, but one of the examples is that in Liberia we found that there is a belief in the community and in beneficiaries and their fellow community members that there wasn't from NGOs, particularly around Ebola messaging. And we had success in that instance by using the local communities. And community messaging, when it's appropriate to the context, is far more effective. And what we tend to see is bad community messaging is where there's a template, almost like a SOP that you'd get in safety and security, that we use in every context for a particular kind of response. And it just doesn't work in every context. And we don't tailor it because we don't involve the community in the design of those messages. And sometimes the best kind of community involvement comes when we already have a presence. The hardest kind of community involvement is when you don't have a presence and you're starting from scratch, and the quickest way is not to involve the community because it's too hard to find out who that community is and where they are. And that can be a challenge as well. So investing in community involvement takes time, but in the long run, my experience is that it can bring an advantage. But we'll come back to that on the flip side. But one of the other dimensions to think about, whether you're the UN or NGOs, is the issue of local organizations. As I've already said, they have access to less than 0.02% of the $22 billion sector that is the aid industry globally. Incidentally, the yogurt sector is worth 60 billion a year. So our sector, as large as it seems, is not as large as the yogurt industry globally. So it was an interesting figure that 22 billion is a lot, but it's nothing compared to some of the private sector industries that exist alongside it. And why are local organizations so disadvantaged in accessing funding? From my experience at least, the most common reason is that donors are not willing to trust them with funding. They want it underwritten by a partner. DFID, for example, works with about 37, 38 international NGOs plus the UN agencies, and that's who they want to work with because they know them, they trust them, and if they don't perform, they know where to find them. With local organizations, we talk, and there's a lot of hype around empowering local organizations, but when it comes to handing over the cash, there is still a lack of trust between the donor and the end user. And what we find, and IRC is equally guilty as long as many others are, is we apply for the funding, we take a share of the costs, and then we give the balance to local organizations. The challenge is that when we take a share of the costs, we are squeezing the end implementer, and they can't hire finance staff and grant staff to manage the funding appropriately. So it's a vicious cycle of local organizations don't manage the funding they get well enough because they can't afford to hire the staff to manage the funding well enough, because everyone is taking a slice of the pie all the way down. How do we solve that? Well, it's a question that's going to come up, I think, in the World Humanitarian Summit next year.